What would you do if your husband handed you an ultimatum in front of his entire family, certain you would fold like you always had before? What he did not know was that I had spent 4 months quietly building the exact evidence that would end his family's carefully polished reputation. By the next morning, phones were ringing across 3 states because I had sent one single email nobody in that family was prepared to open. My name is Delaney Marsh, and this is the story of how a Christmas Eve dinner in a Nashville suburb unraveled a decade of secrets nobody thought a daughter-in-law would ever find. 3 years ago I believed I had built a stable life with my husband, Weston Cole, in a quiet neighborhood outside Nashville, Tennessee. I was 32, working as a financial analyst, and Weston sold commercial real estate on commission, which meant our income moved like a tide, high some months and nearly gone in others. We had a son named Oliver, 4 years old, who loved fire trucks and asked me nightly why the moon followed our car home. On the surface everything looked ordinary and even enviable, the kind of life people compliment at parties without ever asking a real question about it. What people did not see was the silence that lived underneath our finances, the way Weston changed the subject whenever I asked about our savings account balance. I told myself every marriage has blind spots, and I let that sentence excuse far more than it should have. The deeper problem was never only Weston, it was his mother, Judith Cole, who decided within 3 weeks of meeting me that I was the reason her son had stopped chasing his college degree. She said it in front of a dozen relatives at a summer barbecue, and from that day forward nothing I did was ever going to be enough for her. If I worked, I was neglecting my son, and if I stayed home, I was living off her son's paycheck, and there was no version of me Judith would have accepted because the acceptable version never existed. She adored Paige, her other daughter-in-law, who quit her job the year she married Weston's brother Marcus and never worked outside the home again. I used to wonder if Judith actually believed the things she said about family, or if she simply needed a version of womanhood that made her own choices look correct. Every December we drove 90 minutes to Weston's parents' house for Christmas Eve, a house with a chandelier too large for its dining room and a locked glass case in the hallway displaying Weston's father Grady's collection of vintage pocket watches. That year Oliver had just turned 4, old enough to run through the house but not old enough to understand why he should not touch his grandfather's untouchable glass case. I spent most of the evening chasing my son away from that case while Marcus sat in the living room with a beer, occasionally glancing over like my parenting was a form of entertainment. By the time we sat down to eat, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the cooking, an exhaustion built from 6 years of holding my tongue at that same table. Judith waited until every plate was full, because she always liked an audience before she said the thing she had been waiting all night to say. Here is where the night turned, and where I finally understood that some silences are not peace, they are simply debts collecting interest until somebody is forced to pay them. Judith asked, in that same syrupy voice, whether I still sent Oliver to daycare, because a boy needs his mother and not strangers raising him. I answered as calmly as I could that I worked because our household needed the income, and because I wanted to, and the table went quiet the way tables go quiet right before a storm. Weston kept his eyes on his plate, the same way he always had, and something inside me that had been fraying for years finally gave out completely. I said that I paid half our mortgage, that I covered our mortgage, that I covered our son's daycare, and that I had personally paid off $4,000 of Weston's credit card debt without a single complaint. Judith smiled the way people smile right before they twist the knife, and said there it is, always keeping score, no wonder my son looks miserable. I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the hardwood floor, and I said the words that would end that entire night in silence. I said, ask your son why our savings account has less than $300 in it, and why he borrowed $18,000 from my mother 2 years ago that was never repaid. Nobody at that table moved, and Weston's face went the color of the tablecloth, because he knew exactly what I was about to say next. I told them my mother believed that money went toward a broken water heater, when in reality it had been moved into a high-risk trading account that lost nearly 70% of its value within months. Weston stood so fast his own chair nearly tipped over, and in front of his mother, his father, his brother, and his brother's family, he said the sentence that would cost him everything. He said, apologize right now or pack your things and leave, certain I would choose the apology because I always had before. I looked past every furious face at that table toward the living room, where Oliver had fallen asleep on the couch with his toy fire truck still tucked under one arm. And the anger inside me simply left, replaced by something colder and far more certain than anything I had felt in 6 years of marriage. I said okay, and Weston had no idea that word was never surrender. It was the first second of a countdown he could not stop. Weston stayed behind that night to let his mother tell him he had done the right thing, while I drove home alone with our son asleep in the back seat. Somewhere on that dark interstate I stopped shaking, because a plan I had been quietly building for 4 months without admitting it to myself finally came into full focus. I am a financial analyst, and numbers do not lie to me the way people do, so for 4 months I had been pulling bank statements, screenshots, and transaction histories into a folder labeled nothing more exciting than tax documents. What I found made my stomach turn, because Weston had taken out a boat loan in both our names using a signature a document examiner later confirmed was forged. He had missed 2 mortgage payments he swore he had handled, catching them current only after late fees were quietly paid from an account I never knew existed. Tennessee is a one-party consent state, which means it is legal to record a conversation you are personally part of, and I had been carrying a small recorder for months because Weston had a habit of insisting later that he never said what I remembered clearly. That Christmas Eve dinner was on the recorder too, every single word of it, and by the time I pulled into our driveway I was no longer a woman fleeing a bad night, I was a woman holding the final piece of evidence she needed. I packed 2 suitcases, gathered Oliver's passport, and remembered my grandmother's words from years earlier, that every woman should have a way out even if she never plans to use it. Then I opened my laptop and booked 2 tickets to Auckland, New Zealand, a city Weston had 0 contacts in and 0 ability to reach without a passport he did not have ready. Before we boarded, I sent 1 email, not to Weston, but to my attorney, containing the recording, 4 months of statements, the forged signature analysis, and a fully drafted divorce petition. By the time Weston realized we were gone, Oliver and I were already 30,000 feet over the Pacific, and his family's carefully built version of our marriage was about to collapse in real time. Within 48 hours, the bank flagged the forged boat loan for review, which meant Weston suddenly had a fraud investigation attached to his name that he could not blame on me. My mother, who had never been repaid that $18,000, learned for the first time that the money she believed went toward a water heater had actually funded a trading account that lost most of its value in weeks. I sent Judith a single factual email with the Christmas Eve recording attached, and a note that read, "You asked why your son looks miserable, now you know." Judith called me 11 times in 1 hour while I sat somewhere over the Pacific Ocean with my phone in airplane mode and my son asleep against my shoulder. Here is where this story takes a turn I genuinely did not see coming, even after everything I had already uncovered on my own. 2 weeks after we landed in Auckland, my attorney called with an update from the forensic accountant reviewing the forged loan as part of the fraud investigation. They had found a pattern of small structured transfers moving out of Weston's trading account and into an account belonging to his father, Grady, stretching back nearly 3 years. At first everyone assumed it was simple financial support, a father quietly helping a struggling son, until the forensic accountant discovered the transfers began long before Weston's own losses ever started. It turned out Grady was the one who had introduced Weston to that same high-risk trading platform in the first place, years earlier, without ever telling his wife. Grady had also been quietly draining a family trust originally set up from his late mother's estate, a trust meant for his grandchildren's education, redirecting portions of it into the very same account for over a decade. Judith, the woman who once told me a good wife should never question her husband's decisions, learned at 61 years old that she had been living that exact life without knowing a single detail of it. The man behind that locked glass case of untouchable pocket watches had spent a decade hiding financial decisions from his own wife, decisions that eventually pulled his son into the same pattern of secrecy. If you are still watching, I want you to know the story does not end with the money, because one more discovery was still waiting inside those bank records. Buried inside Weston's phone records, which became part of discovery during the divorce proceedings, was a second secret that had nothing to do with his father at all. For the past year, Weston had been involved with a co-worker named Renee, a woman who, it turned out, had also invested her own savings into Grady's trading platform on Weston's recommendation. Renee had lost almost everything she owned trusting a man who was simultaneously telling his own wife their household was simply going through a slow commission season. When my attorney contacted Renee as part of the fraud investigation, Renee agreed to testify, because she too wanted answers about where her money had actually gone. The divorce was finalized 8 months later, and Ohio courts move slowly, but forged financial documents and 2 separate fraud victims have a way of speeding a judgment along. Weston was ordered to repay my mother in full with interest over a structured 3-year payment plan enforced directly by the court. The forged boat loan was voided entirely, and the bank pursued its own investigation separately, resulting in formal fraud charges against Weston tied to the falsified signature. I was awarded full custody of Oliver, with supervised and limited visitation for Weston pending the outcome of his ongoing legal situation. I never spoke to Judith again after that single email, though a cousin still checks in occasionally and told me Judith and Grady separated within the year, unable to recover from discovering their entire financial life had been built on decisions made behind each other's backs. Marcus and Paige, for their part, went quiet, no apology, no acknowledgement, just the same silence I had offered that family for 6 years finally returned to sender. As for me, I stayed in Auckland longer than I had originally planned, and Oliver started at a small preschool built around a courtyard with an enormous pohutuka tree in the center. I kept my job remotely for the first year, waking early to match the old time zone, working from a kitchen table with a view of harbor water instead of a cul-de-sac. There is a particular kind of quiet I found there that I had never experienced before, not the tense holding your breath quiet of Judith's dining room, but an easy quiet where no one was waiting for me to say the wrong thing. I think about that Christmas Eve table sometimes, the chandelier too big for the room, the glass case nobody questioned, and the silence I mistook for peace for far too long. Weston believed he was giving me an ultimatum that night, certain I would choose the apology because I always had before, and he was wrong in a way that cost him everything he thought he had protected by staying quiet. Some people build an entire life on secrets, assuming the people around them will always choose comfort over truth, and Weston's family assumed exactly that of me for 6 long years. They were wrong, and it cost them a marriage, a fortune, and a family that will likely never sit at the same table again. If this story kept you watching until the very last word, that is exactly the kind of story I tell on this channel every single week. Subscribe now so you never miss the next story, because the next family secret is already waiting, and I promise you will not see that twist coming either.